Hey there. Tonight we're diving into one of the most disturbing corners of royal history. A story not of glory or grandeur, but of decay, disease, and a bloodline pushed past its limit. This isn't the tale of a mighty king who conquered nations. It's the life of a boy born into power and into pain. Charles II of Spain wasn't just a ruler. He was a warning. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare to meet the most inbred king in history. They say he was born at night, in silence. Not the celebratory silence of reverence, but the strained quiet of worry. Outside the palace, bells rang to announce the arrival of a king's heir. But inside, the air was heavy with hesitation. The queen had labored for hours. Too long, said the midwives, but eventually delivered a boy, a prince, Charles. His skin was pale and mottled, his limbs oddly soft. He did not cry right away. When he did, it was thin, irregular, as though his body hadn't yet decided whether to live. Courtiers forced smiles, bowed to the cradle, and whispered prayers to saints whose names they barely believed in. The king, Philip IV, looked on with hollow eyes. He had buried other children. He needed this one to live, not just live, but rule. But already, in the dark folds of that royal blanket, something felt wrong. Not cursed, not divine, just frail. The wet nurses took turns feeding him, but he struggled to suckle. His mouth wouldn't close properly, and his jaw looked slack, too large for such a small head. Every doctor in Madrid had a theory. Some blamed the stars, others the blood. No one dared say it aloud, but they all knew he was weak. Not ill exactly, not broken, just unfinished. As if God had gotten tired halfway through. The queen wept in secret, not from shame, but from fear. She had delivered the kingdom its heir, yes, but not its future. He was baptized quickly, lavishly, almost desperately, as though holy water might straighten his limbs or strengthen his bones. Foreign ambassadors sent polite congratulations wrapped in silk and suspicion. Was this the boy who would one day command the world's most powerful empire? They smiled, of course, and made notes. Quiet, careful notes. As he grew, or rather as time passed, the doubts did not fade. He was slow to lift his head, to grip a finger, to look at faces. His legs were soft as dough, and his nurses often whispered that he felt more like a doll than a child. But he was a prince, and a prince must be celebrated. So his birthdays were grand, his portraits painted with generous imagination, his milestones fabricated if necessary. They said he had laughed at a joke, though no one could recall which joke. They said he had taken a step, though the floor remained unmarked. All the while, Philip watched with clenched jaw, aging quickly under the weight of hope. This child was his last bet. His final gamble. Spain was stretched thin, her coffers bleeding, her empire cracking. Only a strong successor could hold it together. And Charles, for all his silk and incense, trembled when the wind changed. By the time he was 2, whispers had turned into stories. Not public ones, not yet, but stories nonetheless. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched one. They said sorcery lingered in his cradle, that his soul had been bartered by ancestors too eager to keep their blood pure. Some believed he had inherited not just a kingdom, but its sins. The family tree of the Habsburgs twisted backward onto itself, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, generation after generation, until nature had no more tricks to offer. Charles was not born to be king. He was born to be a symbol of pride, of warning, of what happens when power is hoarded, when bloodlines fold inward. And yet, despite it all, despite the trembling hands, the delayed speech, the bones that bent before they broke, he was the most important person in Spain. The little body in the golden cradle wasn't just a child. It was the future, or at least what was left of it. He was not ugly in the usual sense, not the kind of unpleasant face that could be brushed off with a polite phrase or dim candlelight. His features didn't clash, they collapsed. The nose didn't sit above the mouth, it loomed over it. The mouth didn't close, it sagged open like a wound too tired to heal. His lower jaw jutted forward, impossibly long, like it belonged to some older species that had never quite gone extinct. His tongue, thick and oversized, spilled inside this half-formed skull, as if trying to escape. It was not a face that greeted you. It confronted you. Slowly, silently, unapologetically. Portraits tried to smooth it, to flatter the line of the jaw or soften the lips. But oil and pigment have their limits, and even the most loyal artist could not erase the truth. There was no symmetry to be found, only a slow-motion collapse, generation by generation, bone by bone. The Habsburg jaw was already infamous long before Charles. A badge of family pride turned grotesque over time. What had once been a mild feature, an angular chin, a strong jawline, had, through centuries of inbreeding, become monstrous. With each generation, the line thickened. The bite shifted. The teeth no longer met in the middle. By the time Charles was born, the mutation was no longer cosmetic. It was crippling. He struggled to chew. He could not pronounce certain sounds. When he tried to speak, the words fell out of his mouth in clumps, slurred and damp. Courtiers leaned in to understand. Foreign dignitaries politely nodded at nonsense. His face did not allow intimacy, only accommodation. And yet, around him, everything remained ornate and ceremonial. Drapes, brocade, tapestries, layers of texture and color trying to compensate for the body at the center. But no fabric could cover the shape of his skull. It was inherited, inevitable, and irreversible. From behind a curtain, children whispered about the king with the crooked face. Some said he had been cursed as a baby. Others believed he had two mouths. Servants avoided his gaze not out of fear, but out of instinctive discomfort. There's a certain kind of unease reserved for deformity, the kind that cannot be explained away by accident or injury, but instead feels ancient, like a punishment slowly carved into bone. He was surrounded by mirrors, but they were placed high or angled sideways, so he wouldn't see himself directly. He didn't need to. The world around him reflected enough. His mother doted on him with a frantic love, smothering him with rituals and reassurances, as though kindness could reconstruct cartilage. His advisors, meanwhile, drafted plans behind closed doors, knowing that diplomacy would have to mask what nature could not. Spain had no stronger claim to power than this boy's face. And that face, they knew, would never lead. As Charles aged, the asymmetry grew more pronounced. His face elongated downward, as if pulled by its own weight. The jawbone seemed to resist the rest of his skull, dragging it out of balance. His eyes were slightly misaligned, one slightly higher, the other drifting outward during moments of stress. He could not whistle. He could barely smile. And yet smiling wasn't expected of him. He was a king, not a companion. He did not need to charm, only to exist. But even that was becoming harder. Pain bloomed quietly inside the joints of his jaw. Chewing brought headaches. Speaking brought fatigue. His tongue often lolled out during sleep, drying and cracking by morning. The face that had been inherited as a symbol of power had become a daily affliction. And beneath the deformity, something worse was hiding. The knowledge that he was not a mistake of chance, but of design. They had made him this way, on purpose, and now they needed him to smile. By the time most children were running through corridors, skinning knees and breaking toys, he was still being carried from room to room like a porcelain relic. His legs were there, certainly, two thin, pale limbs wrapped in velvet and silk, but they didn't hold weight. They dangled. They trembled. Sometimes they curled inward, as if trying to fold back into the safety of the womb. No one dared to say it aloud, but the truth grew heavier with each passing year. The boy could not walk, not properly, not steadily, and not soon. His nurses massaged his calves. His doctors prescribed leeches, steam, infusions of strange roots. Priests lit candles beside his cradle, whispering Latin phrases into the stale air. All of it meant to coax life into limbs that simply refused to obey. He was 5, then 6, then 7. Still, he could barely stand without clutching a chair. His bones bent with effort. His balance betrayed him. And always someone was there to catch him before the fall. At 8 years old, he took a step. One step, then another. It was not graceful, not firm, but it happened. The court erupted in celebration, as though the act had been an achievement of national importance. Trumpets sounded, bells rang. The boy who could not walk had walked. But the pageantry couldn't disguise what everyone knew. This was not strength. It was choreography. His steps were weak, jerky, unstable. His muscles lacked tone. His joints lacked confidence. And beyond the physical awkwardness was the deeper wound. He did not understand why they clapped. Walking wasn't triumph for him. It was terror. Each movement felt like betrayal, like asking his body to do something it was never designed for. And yet, from that day forward, he was expected to stand at ceremonies, to sit on thrones too high for his legs, to appear in front of generals, nobles, and ambassadors as the embodiment of Spanish power. But his limbs still whispered no. He was king in name. Of course, crowned in youth, adorned with every title imaginable. Defender of the faith, Lord of the Indies, sovereign of the Spanish Empire. But the list of things he actually governed was short. Very short. He didn't read edicts. He didn't lead councils. He didn't study statecraft. Instead, he sat. He nodded. He blinked slowly through long meetings, occasionally mumbling something unintelligible, which his advisors would translate into royal will. The machinery of government rolled on without him, powered by regents, ministers, and foreign envoys with louder voices and firmer hands. His mother ruled in his stead for years. Then others took over. He was never alone, but he was never in control. Even the documents he signed were placed before him with rehearsed explanations and a servant to guide his hand if needed. It wasn't abdication. It wasn't even delegation. It was absence. And the throne, no matter how ornately carved, was hollow when he sat upon it. He was not stupid, though many believed he was. His slowness was mistaken for ignorance, his quietness for vacancy. But somewhere behind that drooping gaze and misshapen mouth, there was awareness, a flicker of comprehension, perhaps even resentment. He understood that others spoke on his behalf, that decisions were made before he entered the room, that when he spoke, people listened not to understand, but to endure. And he understood that his body had betrayed him, that he had been born into a shape that did not fit the world it was meant to command. He never led an army, never rode into battle, never walked among the common people. He watched life from a throne that might as well have been a cage. And Spain, vast and fracturing, drifted on without him, like a ship whose captain sat motionless at the wheel, eyes open, hands still, as the sea slowly rose around him. The Habsburgs believed in purity, not spiritual purity or moral clarity, but blood. Thick, noble, royal blood that ran in tight loops through centuries of alliances and marriages. To outsiders, their family tree looked impressive. Kings, queens, emperors, archdukes. But anyone who studied it closely would notice a strange shape. The branches didn't reach outward. They folded in. They twisted back upon themselves, circling like a snake swallowing its own tail. The same names repeated: Charles, Philip, Joanna, Maria. Not because of tradition, but because they were the same people. Over and over again, joined by marriage, joined by blood, until there was no difference. Cousins married cousins. Uncles took nieces. Siblings were matched in whispers and signed contracts. The church frowned in public and blessed in private. And by the time Charles II was born, the circle had tightened to a dangerous knot. He was not just the son of a king. He was the concentrated result of generations of refusal to look outside the family. His parents were uncle and niece, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria. This union was not considered scandalous. It was policy. It was expected. It was, in their minds, strategic. Better to marry your own blood than risk polluting the line with outsiders. Better to seal alliances with shared ancestors than foreign promises. But biology is not so easily commanded. With every generation of inbreeding, the risks multiplied. Mutations once rare became common. Disorders once dormant awakened. And so Charles II inherited not just titles, but consequences. He had a calculated inbreeding coefficient of over 25%, a number comparable to the child of a brother and sister. His very existence was a statistic in the failure of dynasty logic. The empire had built walls around its bloodline, and now there was nowhere left to go. No more branches to graft. Just a circle tightening around a child who could barely hold his head up. This was not a secret. Not really. Whispers moved across Europe with every royal birth, every betrothal. Diplomats made jokes behind fans and goblets. Medical reports from foreign doctors couched brutal truths in soft Latin. The Spanish court itself grew defensive, even proud. They wore their isolation like armor, convinced that divine right overrode physical reality. If God had chosen the Habsburgs to rule, then surely he would sustain them, no matter how warped the vessels became. But history is not kind to closed systems. The signs were there: miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who lived only long enough to be named and mourned. Each new child was a coin tossed into a well with less and less hope. By the 17th century, the family wasn't producing heirs. It was reselling them. And Charles, sickly, malformed, and mentally stunted, was the final return on centuries of genetic investment. The line hadn't just ended. It had folded in on itself and collapsed. When Charles sat on the throne, he carried all of this in silence. His face was a record of decisions made long before he was born. His body was a document no historian could ignore. He was not a mistake. He was a product, a design, executed faithfully, without deviation, until the design itself became the flaw. Spain had gambled everything on a bloodline that refused to mix, and lost. The great family tree, meant to stretch across continents, now curved inward like a dying vine. In private chambers, some courtiers spoke of new matches, new unions, fresh alliances. But it was too late. The damage had been done generations ago, not just in the body of Charles, but in the mindset that created him. His birth was not the beginning of a reign. It was the echo of a dynasty's refusal to change, and by the time anyone admitted it, there were no branches left to save. She called him uncle before she called him husband. Mariana of Austria was 13 years old when she was married to Philip IV of Spain, her own uncle, a man 30 years her senior. The arrangement was not an accident. It was orchestrated with precision, down to the blood. Mariana had royal blood from both her Habsburg parents, and Philip needed an heir. His first wife, also a Habsburg, had given him children, many of whom had died, but none survived long enough to carry the crown. The solution, it seemed, was to double down. If one line of Habsburg blood was good, then two, interwoven and purified, would be better. So the niece became a queen, and the uncle, already tired and aging, became a husband once again. Their wedding was celebrated with full court splendor, as if the union were blessed by heaven, not born from a narrowing family tree. No one mentioned the risks, or rather, everyone mentioned them quietly. Charles was born 9 years later. By then, Philip was an old man in a crumbling empire, and Mariana was still young, but worn thin by miscarriages, stillbirths, and endless ceremony. Charles was the only child of their marriage to survive infancy. His birth was not joyful. It was anxious. He arrived small, weak, and visibly unwell. Doctors took one look at him and began praying. His skull was misshapen, his limbs underdeveloped, his eyes unfocused. But none of this was unexpected. The inbreeding between Philip and Mariana had not occurred in isolation. Their union was just the final tightening of a long, spiraling chain of consanguineous marriages stretching back generations. Philip himself had married his niece. Mariana, for her part, was the daughter of Philip's sister and the Emperor Ferdinand III, who was also a Habsburg. In Charles's family tree, the same names circled back upon themselves again and again. He had fewer unique ancestors than any monarch of his age. His DNA was not a tapestry, it was a knot. Modern geneticists with the cold clarity of centuries have estimated Charles's inbreeding coefficient at over 25%. That number doesn't just mean he was the product of close kin. It means he had the same degree of genetic similarity as the child of a brother and sister. It meant a higher likelihood of deformities, cognitive impairment, sterility, and premature death. In Charles, all those possibilities became reality. He was unable to chew food properly due to a deformed jaw. He couldn't speak clearly. He didn't walk until late childhood. He was plagued by infections, seizures, and undiagnosed illnesses. Every function of his body, digestive, reproductive, neurological, was compromised. It was as though his body had inherited only the worst fragments from both lines, doubled and reflected back like a broken mirror. The sins of the dynasty had been paid forward, and the debt had come due. And yet, no one stopped it. Not truly. Even after Charles's health became impossible to ignore, even after his marriages failed to produce an heir, even after the empire began to tremble beneath the weight of uncertainty, his blood was still treated as sacred. Mariana continued to rule as regent, cloaking her son in incense and protocol, even as he wasted away before her. The court carried on with marriages and ceremonies, blessing more unions between cousins, more nieces promised to uncles. The logic of the dynasty had become a death spiral. Charles was not the first warning. He was the final consequence. His face, his body, his agony. It was all written in the names that repeated on the family register like a curse. When he died, The line ended not with war, but with biology. And the marriage that had created him, between a man and his niece, was no longer strategy. It was evidence, a living, suffering document of how royal blood could rot from within. He was always hungry, not with the appetite of youth or the indulgence of royalty, but with the frantic urgency of a body that never held what it took in. Meals disappeared into him like rain into cracked stone, absorbed nowhere, retained by nothing. The palace kitchens labored to prepare elaborate courses, roasted meats, sugared fruits, rich breads soaked in cream. Dishes meant for kings, served with fanfare, presented in gold. But Charles chewed slowly, awkwardly, his oversized tongue pushing food to the side of his mouth, his weak jaw struggling to break it down. Swallowing took effort. Digestion, more. Often he would eat in silence, eyes half-lidded, as though enduring a ritual he did not enjoy. The food would sit in his stomach for a moment, uncertain of its place, then begin its descent too quickly, too violently. Within hours, he was doubled over, and within days, the same cycle would repeat. His bowels never cooperated. Diarrhea was constant, chronic, relentless, humiliating. Physicians described it delicately in their reports. Loose stools, weak humors, digestive irregularity. But behind the euphemisms was a simple truth. His body could not hold anything. Nutrients passed through him untouched. His weight fluctuated wildly. Some seasons he was emaciated, his cheeks sunken, his skin gray and sagging over bones that never grew strong. Other seasons he appeared swollen, not with health, but with inflammation, bloated by imbalance. Every attempt to treat him made things worse. Leeching, purging, exotic tinctures from the New World, all failed. Doctors argued over his condition, suggesting everything from liver rot to demonic imbalance. They fed him boiled herbs, goat milk, crushed pearls, and holy water. Nothing worked. His gut rebelled against every cure. It was not illness in the usual sense. It was absence. His body simply refused to participate in life's most basic transaction. Take, use, keep. The smell lingered around him. Not constantly, not overwhelmingly, but enough that courtiers avoided standing too close. His chambers were scented with incense, always burning, and linen sheets were changed daily by servants who never spoke of what they saw. Accidents happened, even in public, even during ceremony. He would excuse himself mid-audience, escorted by 2 silent aides, his robes lifted to avoid soiling. Sometimes he didn't make it in time. There were rumors that his underclothes were lined with absorbent wool, changed several times a day. Foreign ambassadors sent back letters not just about policy and diplomacy, but about his smell, his trembling hands, the way he shifted in his seat with discomfort. Spain's enemies mocked him. Spain's allies pitied him. But within the walls of his court, everything continued with rigid protocol. Meals were served at the same time. Toasts were made in his honor. The king was ill, yes, but the ceremony was well. It wasn't just physical. The endless cycle of eating and suffering wore him down. He grew afraid of meals, afraid of banquets, afraid of the eyes watching him chew, of the silence that followed when he set down his fork. He began to avoid food, eating only soft things, bland things, sometimes only broth or pieces of bread soaked in milk. But even these caused pain. The discomfort spread upward. His stomach always bloated, his breath sour, his lips chapped from dehydration. He spoke less, moved less, as though conserving what little energy he had. And still, they fed him. because a king must eat. A king must be seen feasting. Paintings showed him with chalices and plates piled high. But the man inside that gilded frame was withering. He had no strength for statecraft, no energy for pleasure. His body had declared rebellion, quietly and persistently, one failed meal at a time. And no one, not priest, not physician, not mother, could bring it back to order. He tried to speak, often, with effort that bent his whole body forward, as if pushing sound through flesh that wasn't made for it. Words emerged slurred, muffled by the thickness of his tongue and the awkward angles of his jaw. His voice was soft and wet, the syllables collapsing before they could form. At times, even his most trusted attendants had to lean in, straining to catch a word or two from the garbled string of vowels. The sounds he made weren't always wrong, but they weren't quite right either. They hovered somewhere between childlike mispronunciation and the guttural echoes of someone choking on water. Yet in every hall and chamber, his voice was greeted with silence. Not confusion, not correction, just quiet deference. Every phrase, no matter how incoherent, was met with nods, with bowed heads, with obedient replies that never acknowledged what had or hadn't been said. The sound didn't matter. The crown did. He had learned from an early age that people would respond to him whether they understood him or not. Tutors taught him to read aloud, but the shapes of the words rarely made it out intact. He could write, but slowly, and with assistance. His signatures were legible only through repetition. In councils, he often mumbled brief replies, occasionally gesturing when words failed altogether. Courtiers would murmur affirmations in response. "As His Majesty commands." An excellent point. "Wisely said, Your Majesty." It became a game they all played. The ministers made the decisions. The king gave his blessing in vowels. Every sentence was rewritten later in documents by scribes who had no idea what he had actually meant, only what others claimed he meant. But no one dared ask for clarification, not because they feared punishment, but because they feared the truth, that there was nothing to clarify, that there had never been a message, just noise. And yet people listened, not to what he said, but to the way he said it. The rhythm of his stammering, the pause between sounds, the direction of his eyes. They listened to silence, to motion, to breath. They listened to the king the way one listens to the wind at night, not for meaning, but for warning. His mother, Mariana, perfected this art. She translated his grunts into policy, his sighs into appointments, his half-sentences into full decrees, and others followed her example. The court became fluent in royal incomprehension. They began to speak around him, not to him. They filled in his blanks with ambition and guessed intentions. Some even claimed to dream of his voice, waking with new interpretations of what he must have meant. Meanwhile, the king sat in silence, blinking slowly, mouth parted slightly open, as if still trying to finish a word he'd begun days ago. They said he was shy. They said he was tired. They never said he was broken. In rare private moments, alone or nearly so, he would still try to form full thoughts, to speak clearly. He practiced the names of saints, the titles of nobility, the words he heard repeated around him, but never quite controlled. But his jaw betrayed him. His tongue grew heavy. His breath came in gasps. Often he would give up and retreat to gestures, shaking his head, pointing with one stiff hand, blinking twice in frustration. He was not unaware of his limitations. He knew that others finished his thoughts for him. He saw the glances exchanged between advisors when he struggled to speak. He noticed the way servants looked past him when he mumbled in their direction. And still, they listened. because the silence of a king was louder than the speech of any other man. In the end, it didn't matter what he said, or even if he said anything at all. He wore the crown. That was his language, and everyone else was expected to translate. The first marriage was arranged like all royal marriages, strategically, publicly, and without affection. Charles was 23. He looked much younger, spoke like a child, moved like an old man. His bride, Marie-Louise of Orléans, was 17, beautiful, and terrified. She arrived in Spain with the grace of French courts still clinging to her sleeves, but the air in Madrid was heavier, the candles dimmer, the prayers louder. Their wedding was celebrated with spectacle, but behind the painted fans and powdered wigs, there was uncertainty. Marie-Louise tried to play the role, dutiful queen, loyal wife, but the first night revealed more than either of them was prepared for. He was clumsy, unsure, and physically incapable. There was no consummation, not then, not later. Rumors began almost immediately, whispered first among servants, then diplomats, then priests. The king could not father a child. The union had a crown, but no future. Marie-Louise grew thinner with each passing year. The court blamed homesickness, poor appetite, even grief. But the truth sat between her and her husband each night, a silence no candle could warm. She cried, often alone, sometimes quietly enough to pretend it was just the wind. She was not ashamed of him, but of what he represented. A queen with no heir was barely a queen at all. The pressure mounted. She was examined by physicians, fed strange elixirs, prayed over by monks. But no one examined him. It was unthinkable to question the king's body, even when it failed so clearly. Instead, they blamed her womb. They blamed demons. Some suggested old French poisons, others suspected witchcraft. She was given potions, relics, even bits of the true cross. But the bed remained cold, and her eyes, once wide with youthful hope, grew dull with disappointment. She died childless at the age of 26, worn out not by disease, but by expectation. 2 years later, they found him another wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess with a sharp tongue and 12 siblings, chosen mostly for her supposed fertility. The logic was cruel and simple. Her family produced children, and she would too, but she did not for lack of trying. She endured the same rituals, the same silent nights, the same mounting fear. Like her predecessor, she quickly realized that Charles was not a man in the usual sense. He was tender, yes, and kind in his broken way. But his body was not capable of what the kingdom required. The second queen grew angry rather than sad. She accused his doctors. She wrote letters home filled with bitterness. She demanded more prayers, more relics, more potions. At one point, she insisted the king had been cursed and brought in exorcists to cleanse him. The rituals grew darker. Candles melted to the floor. Latin muttered like threats. But no miracle came. Eventually, even she gave up. The palace grew quiet again. Charles aged in his chair, and his wife aged beside him, both wrapped in royal fabrics, both failing at the one task they were given. There were no children, no sons, no daughters, no whispers of movement in the womb. Spain watched in anxious stillness as the line slowly, visibly ended. The failure was not just personal, it was national. Every empty cradle echoed with political dread. The Habsburg Empire had poured its legacy into this man's body, and that body had given nothing back. Not love, not life, not a future. His wives did not hate him. They pitied him. And in the dark, behind the drapes and the incense, they wept, not from physical pain, but from the slow, suffocating shame of being royal women in a house built on ghosts. He was the ruler of one of the largest empires on earth, yet when foreign dignitaries met him, they often looked away. Not out of disrespect, but out of something more primitive, an involuntary relax, like flinching from a wound. His body was a collection of mismatched parts, each one shaped by generations of incestuous calculation. His head was too large for his frame, with a protruding lower jaw that seemed to drag his entire face downward. His eyes were wide-set and unfocused, drifting slightly apart as if trying to escape the skull they were trapped in. His skin was sallow, stretched too tightly over bone in some places, sagging in others. His tongue was so oversized it spilled into his speech, choking his words into mush. His lips remained parted, as if the act of closing them required more muscle than he possessed. He looked not like a monarch, but like a man midway through decomposition. Contemporaries wrote about him with care, disguising revulsion behind formal language. The French ambassador described him as short of stature and ill-formed, with a head too large for his body. Another, less diplomatic, noted that he appeared incapable of chewing or speaking without labor, like a man born too soon or too late. His clothes, always luxurious, could not mask the trembling in his limbs or the slackness in his posture. He moved like a puppet with half its strings cut, slow, jerky, uncertain. He rarely met eyes. His hands were cold and often moist, his fingernails brittle. Some reported that he had difficulty swallowing, and that his meals were often interrupted by long pauses to recover his breath. He tired quickly, even when seated. Every effort, standing, speaking, even thinking, left a visible mark on him, like pressing into soft clay. His body was not just weak, it was hostile to function itself. And yet this body was sacred. It was kissed, bowed to, adorned with gold. Priests blessed it, artists painted it, nations pledged allegiance to it. Because it was not just Charles, it was Spain, incarnate. The empire that stretched from Naples to Mexico was represented in this man, whose spine curved awkwardly and whose feet sometimes dragged along the floor. The contradiction was unbearable. Courtiers spoke of divine right, but privately doubted divine design. Superstition filled the gap left by medicine. Some whispered that he was bewitched. Others believed he was the victim of generational sin, the final punishment for a family that had played too long with blood and power. His mother insisted on constant masses. His advisors sought saints and relics, but no amount of prayer could hide what was visible at first glance. Charles's body did not belong to this world. It belonged to some older, darker version of it. A body sculpted by rules no one dared admit still applied. Visitors left his court with unease they couldn't name. Some felt pity, others disgust, but most felt a kind of existential dread. It was not just that Charles was malformed, it was that he was malformed by design. He was not nature's accident, but civilization's. Every twist in his spine, every misaligned tooth, every soft bone was the result of careful, deliberate choices made by people who thought they were preserving greatness. And now that greatness sat slumped in a velvet chair, wheezing through half-formed sentences, nodding to music he couldn't follow, smiling with lips that barely moved. The empire still stood, for now, but the man at its center was already falling apart. He was crowned in gold, but held together by silence. His anatomy wasn't just an affliction, it was a mirror, and everyone who looked into it saw a different horror. Decay, hubris, failure. A king, yes, but a king whose body screamed what no one dared say aloud. It never closed, not properly, not for meals, not for sleep, not for prayer. His jaw hung open day and night, a silent wound that never healed. The lower mandible jutted forward with unnatural prominence, casting a shadow over his chin and lips. It wasn't just a deformity. It was the most visible signature of his dynasty. The so-called Habsburg jaw had been passed from ruler to ruler like a scepter, each generation adding a little more distortion, a little more exaggeration, until Charles bore the final version. His teeth never aligned. His mouth couldn't fully shut. Saliva collected in the corners of his lips. When he tried to smile, it looked more like a grimace. When he slept, his mouth remained open, slack and vulnerable. Servants swore they could hear his breathing from down the corridor. Not a snore, a slow, uneven rhythm, like the breath of something mechanical and failing. Eating was never simple. The simplest foods required concentration. He would chew in slow, sideward motions, pressing food against the side of his mouth where he still had enough pressure to break it. He avoided meat when he could, preferred softened bread, stewed fruits, milk-soaked porridge. But even those presented challenges. Bits of food often escaped the margins of his lips. Servants pretended not to notice. Napkins were changed frequently. Sometimes he would gag mid-bite, forcing himself to stillness until the wave passed. Guests at the royal table learned not to look too closely. The ritual of dining with the king became less about appetite and more about endurance. Diplomats trained themselves to focus on the goblets, the candles, the embroidery on the tablecloth, anything but the mouth that never closed. And yet the mouth was impossible to ignore. It was always there, an opening that spoke of both hunger and inability, a space between speech and silence. He struggled to speak. The jaw made it difficult to form consonants, to control tone, to express emphasis. His tongue was too large for the cavity it was meant to control. His lips couldn't press together. Words emerged like steam through broken pipes, distorted, uncertain, and short-lived. Every sentence took longer than it should have. Listeners leaned in politely, then farther still, until they were nearly breathing his air, just to pass the meaning. Advisors claimed to understand. Secretaries wrote down approximations. Priests offered interpretations that matched their interests. But no one ever truly heard the king. They heard echoes. They heard fragments. They heard the jaw, moving, twitching, struggling to contain what little he had to say. His words were not weapons or tools. They were symptoms. Each syllable a reminder that this man had been shaped by centuries of marriage contracts, each one folding his face into something less human. The jaw was not just his. It was his father's and his grandfather's. It stretched back through Austria, Burgundy, the Netherlands, through kings and queens who married their cousins and passed down portraits that became caricatures. By the time Charles was born, the Habsburg jaw had become less of a feature and more of a curse. Visible proof that too much power kept too close begins to rot. The artists tried to hide it. In portraits, they softened the angles, shaded the shadow, minimized the droop. But even their brushes had limits. The jaw always crept back in. It was the part of Charles they couldn't erase. No crown could distract from it. No robe could drape over it. No incense could sanctify it. It remained, open, exposed, slightly ajar, like a question that no one dared answer. Why does he look like that? And deeper still, why did we let him become this? The jaw didn't need to speak. It said everything on its own. No one could agree on what he was. Not truly. The priests called him chosen. The court called him sacred. The people called him cursed. But the physicians, when the doors were closed and the incense faded, argued in hushed Latin whether he was even viable. Some believed he was a marvel of survival, proof that divine will could hold together what nature tried to abandon. Others saw him as a collection of symptoms, stitched loosely into the shape of a king. His body defied classification. He was not simply weak or sick. He was something else, a mosaic of dysfunction. His bones were soft yet brittle. His eyes seemed dull one day and wild the next. He experienced sudden fevers, blackouts, and seizures, followed by stretches of calm so eerie they felt like death rehearsals. Every physician who examined him left with new questions. None returned with answers. The royal doctors kept notes, but the pages were cautious. They wrote of melancholy, of nervous agitation, of digestive irregularities. Nothing specific. Nothing that might name the truth. Because to name it was to confess failure, not just of medicine, but of empire. Charles was the embodiment of royal blood, and to admit that he was failing meant the system itself was failing. So they hid behind alchemy and astrology. One physician blamed a misalignment of Saturn. Another insisted the king had been born during a moment of cosmic imbalance. Others returned to older fears, demonic interference, ancestral sin, bewitchment. One even claimed that Charles had been hexed in the womb, his soul bound in knots by an enemy of the crown. They burned herbs, drew chalk lines across the floor, and left relics near his bed. If the king could not be cured by medicine, then perhaps he could be corrected by faith or by fear. Some tried actual science. One German doctor, brave or foolish, suggested that Charles suffered from a congenital disorder caused by inbreeding. He was not invited back. Others recommended bleeding, leeching, purging, enemas, emetics. Whatever the body could tolerate, they tried. It didn't help. Sometimes it made things worse. After a particularly aggressive treatment, the king collapsed during Mass and was bedridden for 2 weeks, mumbling nonsense and refusing food. Physicians were summoned from France, Italy, even the Netherlands. Each came with new theories and left with old doubts. They examined his urine, his breath, his saliva. They weighed his feces. They recorded the timing of his blinks. But every diagnosis contradicted the last. They could not explain how a man so fragile had survived infancy. They could not explain how he was still breathing at 20, then 30. And when he neared 40, they began to speak of him with reverence, not because he was holy, but because he defied logic. Behind all their confusion was something no one would write down. Fear. Not fear of Charles himself. He was too soft, too still, too silent to inspire that. But fear of what he represented, that a line of kings so proud and ancient had produced something so visibly broken. That power, hoarded and unmixed, had rendered itself useless. The body of Charles was not just a medical puzzle, it was a political reckoning, a reminder that bloodlines are not eternal, that legacy can curdle. Some physicians, in their most private moments, questioned whether he was even fully human, at least in the classical sense. His pain did not follow rules. His mind flickered in and out of coherence. His voice lacked force. His body was not built for ruling, not built for surviving. And yet there he sat, crowned, dressed, bowed to. A breathing contradiction. Not a king in decline, but a question that medicine could not answer and history could not ignore. It was a detail most people would never think about. A tongue, not the kind used for kisses or insults, not the symbol of eloquence or wit, but a slab of living muscle that filled his mouth like a misplaced organ. Charles's tongue was too large for the space it occupied, too thick for his palate, too heavy for his jaw. It pressed against his teeth, distorted his words, and sagged visibly when he grew tired. It wasn't always obvious at first glance. Some portraits even tried to hide it. But anyone who saw him speak, eat, or breathe for more than a moment could tell. This tongue was not built for life. It was a weight, a burden, something that turned basic functions, chewing, swallowing, speaking, into labor. When he opened his mouth, it often seemed like the tongue emerged before the thought. Wet, slow, and clumsy, it caught on syllables and muffled commands. It was not just a part of him. It defined him. As a child, it caused choking. Nurses kept cloths nearby to wipe saliva that pooled in the corners of his lips. He was prone to gagging, especially at night, when the tongue relaxed further and blocked his airway. Several times, he was found nearly unconscious in bed, breath shallow, lips blue. Physicians were called, but they could do little. They recommended sleep upright, stronger pillows, softer food. Nothing helped. The tongue remained, stubborn and swollen. It distorted his face even at rest, giving him a look of perpetual discomfort. His jaw strained to accommodate it. His lips stayed parted because they had no other choice. When he tried to smile, it was not charm, but confusion that spread across his face. An uneven twitch that unsettled those who witnessed it. The court, ever polite, called it his melancholy look. But it was simply anatomy refusing to cooperate. Speech was the worst of it. He could form words, but slowly, and not always accurately. The tongue blunted his consonants, softened his vowels, and turned long thoughts into short gasps. He slurred, mumbled, trailed off. Those close to him learned to interpret fragments. Others simply nodded along, pretending to understand. He hated repeating himself, not because of pride, but because each attempt cost him breath and energy. Public audiences became a performance of patience. The king speaks, the court listens, and then someone else fills in the blanks. When documents were read aloud to him, he nodded or blinked in reply. When he was asked questions, his answers came with long delays and short sounds. He was not mute, but his tongue ensured he might as well have been. It translated thought into noise, not language. It made every sentence an ordeal, not an expression. Even in silence, it betrayed him. During meals, it moved awkwardly, forcing food to one side of the mouth or pushing it forward against his teeth. He chewed carefully, often grimacing from effort. Drinking was worse. Liquid slipped down the wrong path, causing coughing fits. He avoided spicy or acidic food, not from taste, but from sensitivity. His tongue would swell even more, growing sore and cracked. In portraits, his mouth remained slightly open, the tongue barely hidden behind painted lips. At night, it dried out from exposure, requiring frequent sips of water. And in sleep, it sometimes lulled free from his mouth entirely. Servants reported strange sounds, wet breaths, gurgles, shallow wheezing. No remedy existed. No doctor dared suggest surgery. It was, after all, part of the royal body, sacred by definition. But for Charles, it was a daily punishment. Not sharp like a wound, but constant like gravity. A tongue too large to hide, too heavy to forget, and too stubborn to let him live in peace. The palace grew quieter at night, but not peaceful. Curtains were drawn, candles extinguished, and footsteps softened to whispers in the marble corridors. But in the royal bedchamber, stillness was a fragile thing. Charles never slept easily. His body refused rest the same way it refused function. The bed creaked with every movement. Spasms, twitches, sudden jerks that threw the blankets into disarray. His breathing shifted throughout the night, from shallow to ragged to sudden gasps that startled the servants standing watch. They were always there, 2 or 3 at a time, in shifts, eyes half closed, hands ready, because they knew what was coming. The attacks never announced themselves. They arrived like ghosts, quiet at first, then all-consuming. One leg would stiffen, then an arm would contort backward at a wrong angle, then the whole body would seize in place, trembling violently. His jaw clenched, his eyes rolled. Sometimes he moaned. Sometimes he didn't make a sound at all. There was a copper basin near the bed, always ready. When the spasms came, servants scrambled to keep him from biting his tongue, to stop him from choking on his own saliva. They would tip his body slightly, wedge a cloth between his teeth, and wait. It lasted minutes, sometimes longer. Afterwards, he was soaked. His sheets, his shirt, his skin. The basin caught what his body expelled. Bile, phlegm, sometimes blood. The smell clung to the linens, to the air, to the men who carried the basin out. No one spoke of it the next day. The bedding was changed before dawn, incense lit, the room aired out. By morning, the chamber was returned to its theatrical stillness. The king would sit upright in his chair as if nothing had happened. And no one asked. It was understood. What happened at night belonged to the walls, not to the crown. Silence was part of the ritual. Physicians tried to explain it. Epilepsy, possession, nervous crises. Their treatments changed nothing. Holy water was sprinkled across his pillow. Amulets were hidden in the headboard. Prayers were said at odd hours by tired monks. Sometimes the court brought in exorcists, men with cracked voices and trembling hands, who performed Latin rites in low tones while the king slept restlessly nearby. They burned herbs, drew symbols in chalk on the floor, whispered chants meant to drive out demons or disease. It didn't work. The spasms returned with the same violence, the same timing, almost nightly, always after midnight, always without warning. Some nights were worse than others, when the moon was full, when the weather changed, when the court was tense. No pattern lasted long, but the one constant was the bucket, the basin, the cloths, the bodies bent over a body that never healed. These were the real attendants of the crown, not ministers, not generals, but the men who cleaned up what the king could not control. No record remains of how Charles felt about these episodes. He never wrote of them, never spoke of them publicly. But those who were closest to him noticed the dread in his eyes at dusk, the way his hands fidgeted before bed, the quiet tremble in his voice when asking to be left alone. He knew. His body didn't belong to him. It never had. But at night, it became something else entirely. Not just weak, but hostile, cruel, unpredictable. And in those hours, the illusion of kingship fell away. He was not ruler or anointed. He was not Habsburg or heir. He was a man gripped by forces inside his own skin, laid bare in sweat and convulsions, stripped of every title. When morning came, he was dressed again, perfumed, announced. But the basin, emptied, cleaned, and carried away, was the truer symbol of power. Not gold, not parchment, not crown. Just a metal bowl in the hands of a silent servant, vanishing through a side door before the sun could catch it. When medicine failed, the court turned to magic. Not metaphorical magic. Actual spells, whispered incantations, melted wax, burnt hair. Charles was surrounded not only by priests and physicians, but by a quieter circle of figures who never signed royal documents or appeared in portraits. old women with shaking hands, men in cloaks who carried vials of dark liquid, midwives who had long since lost their license to deliver children but still knew what herbs made the body warm or the mind compliant. At night, they were brought into the palace through servant doors. Sometimes they came alone, sometimes in pairs. They rarely spoke above a whisper, and they never bowed. They were not there to serve the king. They were there to fix what could not be explained. And for that, they didn't need titles. They needed access to skin, to sweat, to bits of clothing and strands of hair. The court gave them all of it. The first spells were meant for healing. They ground dried frogs into powder and stirred it into wine. They placed stones beneath his mattress, hung iron charms from his bedpost. One woman whispered prayers while tying knots in a strip of black wool, each knot meant to hold in his soul when it tried to leave at night. But when none of that worked, the focus shifted, from healing to desire, from health to virility. The palace needed an heir, and Charles had 2 wives but no child. The logic was crude but clear. If the king couldn't love, maybe love could be forced. So they began the enchantments. Pieces of his clothing were buried in churchyards. Candle wax was poured over his likeness. Bread baked with menstrual blood was fed to him in secret. One queen carried a talisman in her corset for months, told it would draw his affection closer. All of it done under the marble ceilings of Europe's most powerful dynasty. And none of it worked. Some of the spells were darker. Not just charms and tokens, but curses turned inside out. Rituals meant to undo other rituals. A man from Toledo, claiming to be a defrocked monk, spent 3 nights beneath the king's chamber chanting until he collapsed from exhaustion. A woman from Valencia demanded to be left alone with Charles while he slept. She held his hands, breathed onto his face, and muttered over and over, "Love is in the blood, love is in the bone." When confronted by priests, she claimed she was removing bad spirits. The queen believed her. The ministers did not. Eventually, word of these rituals spread to Rome, and the Pope sent an investigator. He arrived quietly, left without comment, and never returned. The Spanish court resumed its routines. Mass at 9, council at noon, spells at midnight. Because by then, no one expected science to solve anything. Charles was beyond science. His body had rules of its own, and superstition, at least, offered the comfort of action. In the end, the palace became a shrine to contradiction. Bibles and bones, incense and amulets, holy water beside bowls of crushed beetles. Physicians and witches worked in the same halls, often for the same goal. They didn't speak to each other, but they passed in the corridors, nodded stiffly, shared candles. One treated the king's body, the other his soul, or whatever might be left of it. When Charles failed to show affection to his wife, they blamed the stars. When he collapsed in fits, they blamed sorcery. When his words slurred and his eyes drifted, they blamed curses. No one blamed the blood. That would mean blaming everyone. So they turned to anything else. They sang, they burned, they whispered, they believed. And Charles, silent as always, endured it all. He let them touch him, pray over him, bind him, wash him, anoint him. Not because he had faith, but because there was nothing left to try. And sometimes even a king has to hope for magic. Wine was poured for him like it was poured for every king before him, generously, ceremonially, and without question. Red from La Rioja, sweet from Jerez, gold-colored and spiced from the coasts. Spain did not lack wine, and neither did the court. Goblets engraved with saints and lions were lifted before meals, raised in toasts, touched to lips with reverence. But Charles never drank like the others. He sipped carefully, reluctantly, as though the liquid might burn more than warm. One swallow, maybe two. And even then, his face twisted. Not from bitterness, but from resistance. His tongue was too thick, his throat too narrow. Swallowing wine made his eyes water and his chest tighten. He coughed more than he drank. Servants tried to dilute the drink, to add honey, to warm it or chill it or sweeten it. Nothing helped. His body refused it, not with violence but with exhaustion. Wine made him pale, made him tremble. It did not dull pain. It added to it. His reactions were unpredictable. Sometimes just a few sips would make his stomach cramp. Other times it would make him dizzy, his speech even more slurred than usual, his already slow movements faltering into stillness. On rare occasions it would spark laughter, short, erratic bursts that startled those nearby and faded just as quickly into silence. But more often, it brought headaches, pressure behind the eyes, a sudden need to lie down. After state dinners, he often had to be helped from his chair, shoulders limp, hands shaking. He'd be escorted back to his chambers, where the servants would remove his heavy robes, sponge his face, and wait for the color to return to his lips. Doctors warned against drink, but the court insisted he be seen toasting. A king without a glass in hand was a symbol of weakness. And so he drank, just enough to participate, never enough to enjoy. Wine, like everything else, became a performance. The irony was cruel. Wine had once been a comfort to his ancestors, something that softened politics, celebrated victories, sealed alliances. His father had enjoyed it. His grandfather had practically lived on it. But Charles's body did not accept pleasure in any form. Not food, not drink, not touch. His bloodline had been distilled too far, boiled down to a fragile essence that couldn't tolerate the things that made life tolerable. He was surrounded by abundance, gold, silk, feasts, but none of it brought him ease. A few gulps of alcohol could wreck his entire evening. And yet, they kept filling his cup. Every time he raised it, the room applauded. Every time he winced, they looked away. His wine was never finished, but always refilled. No one wanted to see the truth, that the very substance used to honor his blood made his blood revolt. There was no indulgence left in his life, only rituals. He sometimes watched others drink, his ministers, his generals, even his wife. They laughed more easily, their cheeks flushed with warmth. They grew louder, looser, freer. He sat quietly among them, glass in hand, sipping just enough to appear present. His lips stayed damp, but his expression remained stiff. Not from etiquette, but from effort. Wine did not loosen him. It didn't make him generous or loving or wild. It made him aware of his body, his frailty, his place. Pleasure required resilience, and he had none. After meals, when the others lingered in conversation, Charles would excuse himself. His stomach turned, his hands sweated, his knees buckled. The wine was already working through him, not as intoxication, but as punishment. He didn't fear death, but he feared discomfort, because it never left. Even the smallest indulgence, one gulp too many, one sip too bold, left him weaker than before. In a court built on excess, he was a man made only for endurance. Even wine had to be endured. They whispered it behind closed doors, and sometimes not even that. El Hechizado, they called him, the bewitched one. Not as a joke, but as an explanation. It was easier to believe that Charles had been cursed than to accept the more obvious truth, that he was the natural result of unnatural choices, that his twisted body and fragile mind were not punishments from God, but the logical outcome of too many royal marriages within too few bloodlines. But people don't like logic when it produces monsters. They prefer mystery. So they imagined demons, hexes, evil eyes cast by jealous enemies. They said a midwife had dropped him on the night of his birth and never confessed. They said witches in the mountains had cursed the cradle. They said the devil had taken an interest in Spain, and Charles was proof. He didn't speak clearly, didn't walk straight, didn't rule. What else could he be, if not marked? Stories spread through the court, then through the city, then across the sea. Some said his blood was black, that it clotted in strange shapes when spilled. Others claimed he slept with his eyes open, and that servants saw shadows move across his bed when no one else was there. Priests began performing extra masses, not for the kingdom, but for the king's soul. Holy relics were placed in his chambers. One bishop brought a vial of what he swore was Christ's blood, and insisted it be kept near Charles's heart. Nothing changed. But change was never expected, only containment. Rumors fed themselves. When the king twitched, it was a sign. When he mumbled nonsense, it was prophecy. When his wives failed to conceive, it was the devil closing the womb. One of his confessor priests claimed that Charles spoke in tongues during sleep. Another, less kind, said the only spirit inside him was old blood trying to escape. The court, desperate for control, turned to rituals. Salt was scattered under his bed. Iron talismans were hung near doorways. Rooms were blessed and re-blessed until the very air smelled of incense and sweat. One advisor, convinced of spiritual possession, arranged a secret exorcism under the guise of confession. Latin was chanted. Candles were lit and burned to the base. Charles blinked and said nothing. He neither protested nor resisted. When it ended, he simply asked for water. But even that was seen as a sign that the demon had retreated, or perhaps that it was thirsty. No one could tell the difference anymore. The line between the real and the invented blurred, until even his most mundane symptoms carried mythical weight. A nosebleed meant bad omens. A stumble meant war. His body became not just a vessel for disease, but a canvas for superstition. And every flaw was interpreted as evidence of something ancient and evil. But Charles wasn't cursed. He was simply himself. A boy born from the choices of others. A man wrapped in gold and rot, stumbling under the weight of expectations he never agreed to carry. He didn't summon spirits. He didn't whisper to the dead. He didn't drag shadows behind him. What he dragged was a name. A crown. A history of decisions made by ancestors who married their cousins and called it destiny. His body was not a riddle. It was a record. His silence was not demonic. It was human. Tired, confused, and profoundly alone. But no one saw that. Not really. They saw a symbol of decline, of punishment, of divine warning. And in the end, perhaps they needed him to be cursed, because a curse can be lifted, a demon cast out. But Charles, he could only be endured. There was no prayer to undo what he had become, because there was no spell to reverse blood. They waited. Year after year they waited, for a birth, a cry, a name, for a child who never came. Charles had 2 wives, a palace full of prayers, and an empire desperate for an heir, but his body offered nothing. No sons, no daughters, no whispered rumors of pregnancies cut short. His queens sat beside him at court, hands folded over empty wombs, eyes dry from repetition. Behind them, Europe held its breath. Spain's empire stretched across oceans and continents, but its bloodline narrowed to a single man who could not reproduce. And the silence that followed every failed year wasn't just domestic. It was diplomatic. Ambassadors returned home with updates that said little, but meant everything. No news, they wrote. No change. And everyone knew what that meant. The king was alive. The dynasty was not. But to admit it openly would be too dangerous. So they didn't. Instead, they planned. France watched with calculation. Austria with hunger. England with caution. The lack of an heir became a vacuum. And in royal politics, vacuums are invitations. Who would inherit the empire? Who would control the Americas, the Netherlands, Naples, the Habsburgs, the Bourbons, the Wittelsbachs? Every court in Europe began drawing maps behind curtains, pairing princesses with potential claimants, drawing family trees with one hand while counting soldiers with the other. Meanwhile, Charles sat on his throne, unaware or unwilling to see that every moment he failed to produce a child brought war closer. He did not hold a sword, but his silence sharpened them. His sterility was not private. It was political, and the longer it continued, the louder the question became. What happens when the king dies? To distract from it, ministers turned outward. They reignited old feuds, reasserted claims, provoked rivals. Anything to give the illusion of strength, of motion, of permanence. Colonial skirmishes were framed as policy. Maritime disputes turned into naval confrontations. Spain flexed not to expand but to reassure. To keep the wolves from sensing blood. Because once they did, they would not wait for a funeral. They would move. The idea was to act as though the dynasty was secure, even if everyone knew it wasn't. Treaties were signed, then broken. Alliances shifted. France, under Louis XIV, offered one hand while sharpening a dagger in the other. Austria prepared legal claims. Every nation built stories to justify what they already intended to take. And all of them pointed back to the same palace, the same man, the same silence. Charles couldn't speak clearly, but in his childlessness he said enough. And so, long before he died, the war had already begun. Quietly, in drafts and rumors, in deployments and oaths. The War of the Spanish Succession didn't start with a trumpet or a cannon, but with a missing name on a baptismal record. It was the war Charles never fought, but always fed. His body, too frail to produce an heir, became the fault line beneath a continent. He never raised an army. He never gave a speech. But he left a vacuum. And nature, as they say, abhors it. When he finally died, the armies were already marching. The crowns already chosen. The borders already redrawn. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a delay. A slow, aching standoff that had lasted decades. His impotence had bought time, but not peace. Because in royal Europe, the absence of a child was never just absence. It was prelude. And Charles, without knowing it, had written his empire's final chapter in nothing but silence. The weddings were grand, as they were meant to be. Foreign banners flew above Spanish stone, church bells rang for hours, and the streets of Madrid were thick with perfume and cheers. When Charles married Marie-Louise of Orleans, the French princess barely 17, the court declared it a new beginning. She was young, fertile, and royal. He was frail, but hopeful. Portraits were painted, gifts exchanged, alliances reaffirmed. But behind the flowers and silks, there was only one expectation. She must give Spain an heir. Not love, not happiness, just a child with Habsburg blood and a name strong enough to hold an empire. That was the purpose. That was the plan. And year after year, it failed. Marie-Louise smiled in public and cried in private. She was examined, prayed over, anointed. Whispers blamed her, blamed France, blamed fate. No one blamed the king. He tried, or so they said. Nights were arranged like ceremonies. Bed linens blessed, candles lit, food chosen for virility. Herbalists provided tinctures. Priests provided relics. Physicians stood waiting nearby. Still nothing. No signs, no swelling belly, no hopeful flutter. Just silence and stillness. And so the questions turned to superstition. Was she cursed? Was he? Midwives checked her pulse and the moon. Confessors searched for sins. Charles remained unchanged, tired, distant, confused. He rarely touched her in public. In private, there were only rumors. Marie-Louise grew thinner. She stopped dancing. She stopped eating. She spoke of returning to France. And when she died, suddenly and without a child, the court murmured of poison, of sorrow, of divine punishment. But mostly they mourned the child that never existed. A queen had died, yes, but more importantly, the heir had not been born. A second wife was found quickly, Maria Anna of Neuburg, German, strong-willed, and from a family famous for its fertility. 12 siblings, the court emphasized. 12. She arrived not with romance, but with expectation. An heir must come, and soon. She was examined upon arrival. She passed. The marriage proceeded like a transaction. She was firm, louder than the first, more assertive. She demanded action. She ordered doctors, charlatans, and exorcists. She insisted on holy relics in the bedroom, charms sewn into mattresses, prayers said during the act itself. She wrote angry letters home. She accused his courtiers of sabotage, his confessors of negligence. But even her fury could not change his body. Charles tried. Again. Or so they said. But the result was always the same. Nothing. No blood. No heir. No future. Just another woman sitting alone in a palace full of silence. The pressure mounted. The church began to intervene more directly. Cardinals sent letters urging renewed effort. Monasteries held vigils. Nobles whispered about annulment, about miracle cures, about whether Maria Anna could quietly adopt and pretend. But adoption was for commoners. A king's heir had to be born under tapestries, to the sound of cannons and bells. Anything less was weakness. The court watched Maria Anna's stomach for signs. Servants timed her illness, her appetite, her steps. Every missed meal became a theory, every sigh a prediction. But she never gave them what they wanted. And so, they waited, year after year, until even the waiting turned bitter. The crown sat heavier on Charles's head with every passing season, not because he wore it alone, but because it had no one else to rest upon. He had married twice. He had followed every ritual. But the line ended with him, not with a cry, but with the echo of one that never came. No one could meet his gaze for long. Not because it was piercing, or regal, or cold, but because it didn't land. One eye sat slightly higher than the other, larger, always a little too wide, as if startled by something only it could see. The other was smaller, drooping at the outer edge, half-shadowed under the weight of its own orbit. Together, they gave him a look of permanent confusion. His face was already a map of inherited distortion, but the eyes made it something more unsettling. He did not look at you. He looked past you, through you, sometimes slightly off to the side, as if watching a scene that wasn't happening in the room. When he listened, he stared into corners. When he spoke, he didn't focus. Courtiers learned to avoid eye contact. It wasn't disrespect. It was self-preservation. Because looking too long into those mismatched eyes felt like staring into a question with no answer. Portrait painters struggled with it. Some tried to correct the imbalance, leveling the eyes, shrinking one, raising the lid of the other. But no artist could completely erase what was there. The royal gaze was supposed to command. His unraveled. In public audiences, he blinked slowly, irregularly, as if processing light just a second too late. His pupils responded, but not always together. Foreign ambassadors noted the effect in private letters, calling it an unsettling stillness or a gaze like fog over glass. It wasn't just a physical flaw, it was a loss of orientation. Charles didn't seem to see what was in front of him. He seemed to see something else, or nothing at all. Ministers often interpreted his silence as contemplation. But those who stood close enough knew better. It wasn't thought behind those eyes. It was distance, a soft, unfocused void where presence was supposed to be. Even in private, his eyes betrayed him. Servants reported that he often stared at empty walls for long stretches, unmoving, unblinking, as though waiting for something to emerge. He didn't follow movement easily. Sudden gestures startled him, not with fear, but with delay. Sometimes he would smile before the joke, or laugh at nothing, as if he were half a beat ahead or behind the room. He blinked unevenly, one lid slower, heavier, reluctant. And when he was tired, the asymmetry grew worse. The right eye wandered slightly, drifting toward the ceiling. The left narrowed as if to compensate. Combined with his slack jaw and misshapen cheeks, it gave him the appearance of a wax figure left too long in the sun. Not grotesque, not monstrous, just wrong, just out of place. A man whose face couldn't decide what it was trying to express, or whether it was trying at all. But the worst part wasn't the structure. It was the meaninglessness. His gaze did not command. It did not inspire. It did not comfort. It simply existed, hollow, floating, misplaced. The eyes of a man who was both there and not. They saw, yes, but what they saw, and whether it mattered, was impossible to know. In the paintings, they tried to anchor him, with a scepter, a curtain, a backdrop of battle or heaven. But nothing could ground those eyes. They wandered the canvas like ghosts, and in life, they did the same. A king is meant to see his people, to see the world he rules. Charles saw nothing, or saw everything, but without understanding. His vision was clear, his focus was gone, and in that loss, in that silent, shifting stare, his whole reign could be read, a crown above a face looking nowhere, a throne beneath eyes that never truly arrived. He didn't die all at once. He unraveled, slowly, softly, like fabric left too long in the sun. Color fading, fibers loosening, shape sagging into something unrecognizable. His skin grew thin first, parchment-colored and dry, cracking at the edges of his lips and around his eyes. He itched constantly, scratching until he bled, then scratching the scabs. His cheeks sank inward, his gums pulled back. His teeth, those few that remained, rotted from the root, their color darkening to brown, then black. Servants avoided standing too close when he spoke. His breath carried a sourness, a hint of something old and damp, like fruit left too long in a sealed box. Doctors called it decay of the humors, but everyone else called it what it was. Rot. The kind that doesn't wait for death. The kind that begins in silence and spreads beneath silk robes and golden chains until even the finest crown can't distract from the smell. Inside, it was worse. His stomach rejected food more often than it accepted it. His bowels moved irregularly, painfully, sometimes not at all. His liver swelled, then shrank, then swelled again. The doctors disagreed on the cause, but the symptoms were impossible to miss. Jaundice in the eyes, swelling in the limbs, blood in the stool. His urine darkened, and the whites of his eyes turned the color of old wax. His heart beat too fast, then too slow. His hands trembled constantly, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Some mornings he could barely sit upright. His joints ached. His feet were cold no matter the season. Blankets were layered onto him even in summer. But heat didn't help. He shivered from the inside out, like something deep within him was already underground, dragging the rest of him down. His body was not aging. It was collapsing, bit by bit. And yet it would not give out. That was the worst of it. The waiting. The way he lingered, year after year, as if his body couldn't decide whether to finish what it had started. Others died of fevers, of wounds, of strokes. Charles persisted, not with strength, but with stubborn tissue. His body wasn't living. It was refusing to die, refusing to release him. Every physician who saw him remarked on it, the unnatural durability of a man so clearly beyond repair. He survives by habit, one wrote, not by health. The palace grew accustomed to his deterioration. New smells were masked with incense. New wounds were left unnamed. New weaknesses were folded into routine. He was lifted into chairs, held upright during ceremonies, painted with rouge to hide the yellow in his skin. But everyone knew. They could see it in his fingernails, ridged and brittle, in his eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, in his posture, slumped like a corpse too tired to lie down. And still, he went on, as if death, like everything else, was afraid to touch him, as if the body itself feared what might happen when it finally let go. Perhaps it thought there was something worse waiting beyond. Perhaps it had forgotten how to stop. Whatever the reason, he decayed in place. Alive but not living. Present but not whole. A king not of majesty, but of residue. The court carried on around him, voices lowered, candles lit early, steps softened to avoid startling the figure who sat breathing heavily beneath too many layers. There was no recovery, no hope of reversal, only maintenance. They oiled his skin to keep it from peeling. They spooned broth into his mouth when he couldn't lift a cup. They whispered prayers as if praying could seal the cracks. But the truth was obvious. He was falling apart. Not dramatically, not violently, just constantly. And beneath the robe, beneath the lace, beneath the weight of history, he knew it. His body was rotting slowly, not because it was ready to die, but because it was too afraid to stop pretending. Spain didn't collapse in fire. It didn't fall to rebellion or invasion. It withered, quietly, gradually, in the corners of its palaces and the backs of its churches. While Charles II sat motionless on his throne, the empire that surrounded him unraveled at the same pace, as if tied to his breath. The silver from the Americas slowed to a trickle. The armies, once feared across Europe, were underpaid and underfed. The fleets rotted in harbors, their sails mended more with prayer than canvas. Spanish nobles grew bloated and lethargic, while peasants starved beneath crumbling walls. Provinces petitioned for relief. Colonies begged for leadership. But the court, like its king, was incapable of response. It moved in ceremony, not in action. Ministers argued over protocol while famine took root. The roads cracked, the coins devalued, and no one raised a voice, not because they didn't care, but because the silence had become normal, predictable, almost comforting. The parallel was impossible to ignore. Charles's body decayed while Spain's institutions did the same. His heartbeat irregular, the economy stagnant. His voice weak and slurred, the state's diplomacy hesitant and confused. His limbs trembling, the empire unsure of its next step. And like the king, Spain refused to admit anything was wrong. At court, they still toasted victory. In churches, they still sang of divine favor. But the world saw through it. France laughed behind closed doors. England watched with sharpened interest. Austria waited like a hawk, calculating inheritance. Allies grew distant. Rivals drew maps. Spain, once the weight at the center of European power, had become a burden. Still large, but unwieldy and slow. Its prestige hung on old memories, its influence held together by ceremony and denial. And at the center of it all sat Charles, still breathing, still crowned, still revered. A hollow man in a hollow court. The rituals continued, because that was all they had left. Portraits were painted, titles were conferred. Religious festivals were held with fanfare no one could afford. When Charles appeared, there were cheers, bells, incense. But no one believed it anymore. Not really. The people lined the streets, not out of loyalty, but out of habit. The army marched because the drums still beat. But loyalty had thinned into ritual, and ritual had thinned into inertia. The king's failure to produce an heir mirrored Spain's failure to produce a future. Its colonies simmered with unrest. Its debts climbed beyond reckoning. And still, they dressed the monarch each morning, placed the crown carefully above a face that could barely hold its shape. The empire was not defeated by enemies. It was eaten from within, by time, by pride, by the long refusal to change. And when Charles finally began to fade, the empire braced, not for loss, but for reckoning. His death would not just end a reign, it would end a line, a name, a fiction that had held too long. Behind closed doors, leaders debated succession, not with urgency, but with exhaustion. There was no clear answer, only consequences. War would come. They knew that, but it would only be the visible part of something long since broken. The real death had already happened, slowly, over decades, like a candle left to burn in daylight. Charles was not the cause. He was the echo. And Spain, like her king, remained upright only out of habit. No collapse, no explosion. Just a kingdom growing quieter each year, breathing through lungs that barely moved, pretending not to notice the rot beneath the silk. The monarch and his empire dying together, not with glory, not with fury, but with silence. The family tree was less a tree and more a spiral. Branches folded inward, names repeated, and titles overlapped until meaning gave way to confusion. Charles's world was filled with relatives, but none of them made sense. His mother was his cousin, and also his aunt by blood. His father had married his own niece, making Charles both son and grandnephew to the same man. Uncles were also brothers. Sisters were technically aunts. His nieces were also his cousins. When ambassadors tried to understand the lineage, they gave up, calling it an enclosed garden of ancestry, choked by its own order. Even inside the palace, the servants got it wrong. Some addressed his relations with the wrong titles, and no one corrected them, because no one could. The genealogy had collapsed under its own weight. The only thing clear was that Charles stood at the end of it. And behind him, a long line of ghosts waited silently, sharing more blood with him than any living soul. He grew up surrounded by portraits of men who looked like him, jaw forward, lip slack, eyes tired. Their faces watched him from oil and canvas with a kind of knowing resignation. Philip II, Philip III, Philip IV, Charles V, Charles I. They were all part of him. And more than that, they were more real than the people around him. He studied their faces more than he saw his own in the mirror. He memorized the folds in their robes, the angles of their swords, the soft rot in their eyes. He didn't know their voices, but he felt their presence. They had done things, ruled, conquered, expanded, decreed. He had only inherited. Their hands signed treaties that changed borders. His hand struggled to hold a quill, and so the dead became his company. At banquets, their portraits loomed larger than the guests. In chapel, their bones rested closer than any living sibling. His blood belonged more to them than to anyone breathing. He had no brothers in the way others understood the word. There were men who might have filled that role, but they were also his uncles, or cousins, or nephews, depending on which part of the Habsburg knot one traced. The royal household often confused who was heir to what, or who should sit at which place. The titles outlived the people who wore them, and in the absence of clarity, Charles floated in the middle of a family web so tightly spun it had strangled itself. He spoke little of family, not out of coldness, but out of uncertainty. His father had died when Charles was young. His mother ruled for him until her own grasp slipped into desperation. The people around him changed their tone depending on the day, sometimes calling him Majestad, with trembling formality, sometimes simply Niño when he fell asleep mid-meal. But never brother, never son. Those words had no clear anchor anymore, only function. And so his shadows became his truest company. The long silhouettes cast by his twisted frame onto palace walls, the warped outlines that followed him through candle-lit corridors. They didn't speak, but they didn't lie either. They didn't change their names. They didn't pretend to understand his lineage. They just remained, silent, dark, faithful. The court around him aged and plotted. Ministers were replaced. Wives were mourned. Names shuffled endlessly in treaties and councils. But the shadows were constant. He sometimes watched them flicker against the stone during prayers, as if they twitched with life his own body couldn't summon. Some said they saw him nodding to them, as though answering a question only he had heard. And maybe he had. Because in a palace full of relatives he couldn't name, it was the nameless that understood him best. Not the men with titles, but the shapes without names. They didn't need to know if they were brothers or uncles. They simply stayed. And unlike everyone else, they never asked for anything. He was not hated. That was the strange part. The people, broken by war and famine, crushed under taxes and superstition, did not curse his name. They didn't call for revolution or vengeance. They didn't rise up with torches. They watched him with a kind of weary pity, like one watches a sick animal in the street, too weak to move, too sad to kill. In villages, his portrait still hung on chapel walls, but children no longer bowed before it. Old women crossed themselves and whispered prayers for his soul, as if he were already dead. In taverns, his name was spoken not with anger, but with a sigh. Poor thing, they said. He was born wrong. Not as a king, as a man. His face, his voice, his silence. It all made sense to them in a way that frightened the court. Because hatred was useful. Hatred meant threat. But pity? Pity meant surrender. Farmers in Castile heard stories of the king who couldn't walk as a boy, who couldn't father children, who couldn't speak without slurring. They didn't mock him. They nodded slowly, murmured something about God's will, and went back to their tools. He was just another burden they had no control over. Another weight added to a cart already full of drought and debt. In Andalusia, they lit candles not for his success, but for his comfort. In Aragon, they spoke of him as a tragic figure, more holy fool than monarch. It wasn't loyalty, it was fatigue. The country had given up on being ruled and instead settled into a kind of endurance. The king was like a fog, always there, always quiet, always heavy. He didn't inspire, didn't command, didn't threaten. He simply existed, and the people, having long since stopped expecting anything from Madrid, learned to live without him. There were no riots in his name, no mobs storming the palace. When taxes rose, people grumbled about ministers, not the king. When soldiers were conscripted, they cursed the generals, not the crown. Charles had become something other than a monarch. He had become a symbol of helplessness, a broken mirror of their own powerlessness. And in that, there was a kind of reluctant affection. He was not like the others, not cruel, not ambitious, not greedy. He was soft, quiet, weak. They saw him in procession once a year, pale under gold embroidery, hand lifted in mechanical blessing, eyes drifting toward the sky. And instead of jeering, they lowered their heads, because he was no longer a figure of authority. He was a figure of grief, a living relic of a world that no longer worked. The crown shone, but the man beneath it seemed lost, and so they pitied him, because they understood what it meant to be trapped in a life that couldn't be changed. The court feared this pity. They tried to paint him with strength, commissioning new portraits, composing hymns, arranging public blessings. But none of it changed what people saw. They saw a king who shook when he walked, who blinked too slowly, who spoke too softly. They saw a man alone in a crowd, and in their own hunger, their own cold homes, their own sleepless nights, they recognized something familiar. He didn't fail them by cruelty. He failed by existing exactly as he was, and that made it harder to hate him, easier to forgive, easier to forget. He would die. They knew that. And someone else would take the throne. But until then, they did not rise. They did not rebel. They simply watched, and waited, and whispered, "He never asked to be king." And in that quiet, bitter mercy, they gave him something no ruler before had received, freedom from blame. Not respect, not love, but release. The Vatican sent its blessings on time, as it always did. Letters inscribed with golden ink, sealed with crimson wax, delivered by men in embroidered robes who bowed too deeply and spoke too little. Prayers were offered for the health of the king. Relics were sent as gifts, splinters of wood said to be from the true cross, bone fragments from obscure saints, a chalice once held by a forgotten martyr. The church maintained its posture, reverent, generous, supportive. And yet something was missing. Not faith, not formality, but words. In every communication from Rome, there was a silence that pulsed louder than any blessing. the Pope addressed Charles as sovereign, as defender of the faith, as son of the Holy Church, but never as man. There was no mention of his body, no inquiry into his suffering, no gentle advice, only polished Latin wrapped around absence. Behind closed doors, the silence thickened. Papal envoys returned to Rome with reports they refused to write down. They spoke instead in guarded whispers, behind cathedral walls, to cardinals who already knew what they would say. That the King of Spain, eldest son of the Church, was unwell. That he stammered, blinked too slowly, needed assistance rising from his chair. That his breath stank of rot. That he trembled during Mass and could not recite a single prayer without choking on syllables. They described his eyes as blank, his hands as wet, his voice as lost. But in the official records, they praised his devotion. They noted his generosity to monasteries. They referenced his frequent communion. Because to say anything else would be to invite a question the Church didn't want to answer. What does it mean when the chosen monarch, anointed by God, is falling apart in front of everyone? So the Church looked away, politely, respectfully, carefully. When Charles sent requests for prayers or papal advice, he received them, but always in generalities. Spiritual encouragement, doctrinal affirmations, never personal guidance, never the intimacy that other monarchs might have received. Popes had scolded kings before. They had offered counsel, warning, even correction. But with Charles, they said nothing. Not out of neglect, but out of discomfort. To acknowledge his state would be to admit that the divine order could produce something so visibly broken. That perhaps this system of succession, this theology of royal blood, had limits. So Rome kept its distance. It sent beautiful words and nothing more. Incense instead of intervention, silence instead of scrutiny, reverence as disguise. And in Spain, the silence was understood, not as insult, as mercy. Charles never questioned it. He received the papal blessings with bowed head. He kissed the crucifixes, held the relics, repeated what prayers he could remember. But deep down, perhaps he knew that even the Holy Father could not look directly at him, that even the Vicar of Christ had chosen not to see. And maybe that was a kindness, because the moment Rome named what everyone already saw, the illusion would shatter. The fiction of sacred blood, the myth of divine monarchy, it would collapse under the weight of one man's breathless body. So instead, they preserved the silence. They framed it in gold, hung it beside the altar, and called it grace. Not because it was holy, but because it was the only thing left. A silence large enough to contain a dying king, a dying empire, and a truth no one wanted to say aloud, that even heaven had run out of words. The silver trays never stopped arriving. Day after day they were carried through the narrow stone corridors by gloved hands, placed gently on silk-covered tables, uncovered with reverent precision. Quail soaked in honeyed wine, veal stuffed with almonds, pastries folded with saffron and fig. There were golden bowls of dates from North Africa, barrels of sweet Andalusian wine, cured meats arranged like ornaments. And all of it, every mouthful, prepared by the finest chefs in Europe, imported or trained at unspeakable expense. Because the king must be fed, not just to sustain him, but to prove he was still a king, even if his body rejected everything, even if the food passed through him undigested, even if the palace reeked of sickness and spoiled meat. The spectacle of wealth had to continue, because to stop would be to admit that the crown itself was starving, just like the people beyond the marble gates. Spain was not well fed. In the outer provinces, bread was scarce. In the cities, inflation rotted the markets. Men fought over barrels of grain, and women boiled shoe leather to soften it into something chewable. Armies waited months for pay. Ships sat idle without funds. Fortresses crumbled from neglect. But in the royal kitchens, there was no shortage. The budget for the palace pantry was larger than the entire northern fleet. Royal pigs were brushed daily. Chickens were sung to, massaged, and kept warm through the winter. They lived better than the soldiers meant to defend the empire. And no one stopped it, because the illusion of abundance was all that remained. Charles could not rule, could not fight, could not produce an heir. But he could eat, or at least pretend to. And for that, entire regions were taxed into silence. The food itself became symbolic. Not nourishment, but denial. The kitchens issued new menus weekly, as if inventing luxury would summon legitimacy. Guests were expected to marvel. Ambassadors were served 10-course meals while debating treaties Spain could no longer afford. But under the gilded cloches and trimmed herbs, the truth festered. The king's appetite was erratic. Some days he refused everything. Other days he gorged and vomited. His tongue made chewing difficult. His teeth, loosened by rot, left half-masticated meat caught in his cheeks. Servants whispered of dishes returned untouched, of feces that floated in the bath, of chamber pots that clinked with undigested kernels. But above all, they kept serving. Because the alternative, admitting that food could not heal a dying monarch, was unthinkable. They believed, or pretended to believe, that maybe the next dish would change something. That more sugar, more meat, more imported cream could fix what centuries of blood had broken. And so the court continued its feast while Spain starved. Dignity by deception. Wealth without weight. Every banquet was both theater and funeral. The king, slouched in robes too heavy for his bones, raised goblets he could barely grip, toasted with slurred syllables, salved with cracked lips, and the guests applauded. They bowed. They offered congratulations, then returned home to write letters filled with dread. Behind the velvet curtains, Spain was collapsing, not with thunder, but with a soft sigh. A nation fed on gold had grown hollow. Its king ate like an emperor, but digested like a ghost. And in that grotesque ritual, course after course, bite after bite, the empire's decline was plated and served, one golden spoon at a time. The portraits still hang in galleries, oil on canvas, lacquered and framed, studied by art historians and tourists alike. But each one is a quiet deception, a slow-motion lie told with brush strokes and desperation. Because painting Charles II of Spain was never about capturing his likeness. It was about disguising it. No artist, no matter how skilled, could ignore what stood before them. The sunken eyes, the protruding jaw, the drooping lips, the slack expression of a man whose body never finished forming. But they tried. With shadow and symmetry, with softened features and strategic angles, they attempted to elevate deformity into dignity. And each attempt only made the truth more grotesque, because no amount of artistic flourishes could erase the fact that the subject on the throne looked more like a warning than a king. The court painters were not amateurs. They were the best that could be summoned. Juan Carreño de Miranda, Claudio Coelho, and others, masters of Baroque realism, trained to immortalize royalty in all its divine grandeur. But before Charles, their palates hesitated. His Habsburg jaw jutted so far forward that it cast a shadow even indoors. His tongue filled his mouth so completely that it distorted the lines of his lips. His skin, pale and sickly, defied all attempts to render it warm or alive. Every portrait became a compromise. His face was often painted in three-quarter profile to minimize the asymmetry. His lower lip, which sagged like a torn pouch, was tightened just enough to suggest control. The eyes, dull and unfocused in person, were repainted to suggest depth, thought, maybe even benevolence. But what emerged on the canvas was never Charles. It was a version of him that didn't exist. Even in their lies, the painters failed. Because something in the images remained wrong. The proportions never quite aligned. The gaze always seemed to drift. His body looked like it had been assembled hastily from borrowed parts that didn't agree with one another. The more they tried to elevate his presence, the more it slipped into the uncanny. Viewers flinched without knowing why. Diplomats who received miniature portraits as gifts reacted with polite confusion. Some believed the paintings to be political satire. Others wondered if Spain had taken to commissioning icons rather than likenesses, so abstracted was the resemblance. But the court insisted on these images. They were hung in palaces, placed in churches, sent across Europe like royal currency. Not to honor the king, but to insist he existed, that he was stable, that he was still part of the divine order, no matter what his body suggested. Behind closed doors, even the artists confessed their failure. Letters from court hint at the difficulty of their task, of painting a man whose very flesh resisted idealization. Some requested permission to paint him only in robes, seated, with head turned slightly. Others begged to use earlier sketches, or even imagined composites. A few drank heavily before sittings. One reportedly wept afterward, not out of cruelty, but out of despair. Because their job was not to reveal the king, but to protect him, to preserve the monarchy's illusion through pigments and varnish. And yet every finished portrait betrayed them, not because it showed the full horror, but because it tried to hide it. And in that concealment, the viewer senses something worse, something lurking just beneath the paint. Not deformity, but pain, loneliness, and a life so physically misaligned with the world that even the finest artists could not make it look human. His name was Carlos. Charles, in the tongues of diplomats. King of Spain, King of Naples and Sicily, Duke of Milan, Lord of the Americas, and a dozen other titles whispered through golden halls. In proclamations, his name was draped in flourishes. Most Catholic Majesty, Defender of the Faith, Pillar of Christendom. But all of it, every syllable, sat like borrowed robes on a frame too frail to hold them. He bore the name of kings, but not the substance. He sat on a throne, but not from strength. Charles was a shadow of rule, a residue of what monarchy had once been, a husk left behind by centuries of dynasty, ceremony, and blood. He was crowned because no one else could be. He was obeyed because the alternative was chaos. But at the core, he was not a ruler. He was a remnant. The court knew. The ministers, the clergy, the generals, all of them moved around him, not with loyalty, but with calculation. They wrote orders in his name, drafted edicts, declared wars and peace treaties, but rarely consulted him. When they did, they used simple phrases, repeated instructions, or spoke as if to a child. Sometimes he nodded, sometimes he blinked without responding. And that was enough, because the system no longer required a king to act, only to exist. Charles became a placeholder for continuity, a warm, flickering symbol that Spain still had a monarch, even if the monarch had no agency. His signature was a ritual, his presence a talisman. The power he embodied was inert, like an heirloom sword too rusted to draw, but too sacred to discard. Outside the palace, Spain was unraveling. Provinces bristled, colonies stirred. The treasury ran dry, and alliances thinned like smoke. But still, Charles remained untouched in his palace, draped in silk, fed by trembling hands, bathed by eunuchs and servants. His life became a performance of kingship, repeated endlessly with no audience left to believe it. He sat through mass as if watching a distant storm. He attended councils where his silence was interpreted as assent. When foreign envoys visited, they bowed. They spoke formalities, they praised his lineage, but they reported home that the throne of Spain was empty, except in name. Charles's body was there, but the will, the fire, the gravity that makes a monarch, that had never come. Or if it had died quietly in the womb. And yet, despite it all, he endured. That was the most haunting thing. He lived long enough to outlast reason. His reign stretched over decades, not by triumph, but by inertia. A kingdom ruled by a title, not a man. And so the contradiction grew unbearable. His name was carved into coins, stitched into banners, etched into church walls. But none of it matched what people saw. A slack figure, a slow mind, a body folded in on itself. Charles was not sovereign. He was survival. He was what remained when lineage outweighed logic, when tradition refused to die, even as the man who embodied it no longer fit the shape of rule. In the end, he was not a king. He was the echo of kingship, wandering through a palace where even the tapestries no longer believed. When Charles finally died, it was not with the solemn closure of a finished reign. It was not even met with relief. It was a pause, brief, awkward, loaded with questions no one wanted to ask aloud. His body, once propped on velvet, collapsed inward, as if the force that had kept him moving had been nothing more than habit. His mouth, perpetually parted by the swollen tongue that had mocked every effort at speech, now fell open for the last time. And under that tongue, as the legend would later claim, they found ashes, fragments of herbs and strange powders, signs of magic or desperate prayers or rituals long forgotten. No air, no will strong enough to keep Spain whole, just a body, limp and lifeless, left in the middle of a crumbling empire. The question of succession, once whispered behind doors, erupted into cannon fire. The War of the Spanish Succession was not a matter of politics. It was a scramble for power, born from the vacuum Charles left behind. Habsburgs, Bourbon, the English, the Austrians, all clawed toward the same golden chair, as if it still meant something more than burden. The continent cracked. Armies moved like storm clouds across fields that had once grown wheat. Villages burned. Churches bled. Treaties fractured. The war outlived the memory of Charles. He had been too weak to govern, too broken to love, too ill to father children. And yet his death carved a wound into Europe that bled for more than a decade. Kings fell. Borders shifted. And through it all, Spain drifted further into irrelevance, ruled now not by lineage, but by the survivors of a war no one truly won. At court, portraits of Charles remained, not for reverence but for reference, a reminder of how deep a throne could rot when blood forgot to refresh itself. The courtiers who had once shielded his deformities now spoke of them freely, as if confessing sins they had been forced to carry. Physicians published notes they'd kept hidden during his life, descriptions of soft bones, malformed organs, and incomprehensible symptoms. The church stepped back from canonization rumors. No miracles, no sainthood, just silence. and in foreign lands, pamphlets circulated mocking the Habsburgs, drawing grotesque caricatures of the man once called Most Catholic Majesty. They laughed, not at his weakness, but at the absurdity of power built on such frail flesh. But within Spain, the grief was stranger. It was not for Charles, the man. It was for what had been lost along the way. His reign marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the fading of a dream, of empire, of divinely appointed order, of a world where crowns meant stability. Charles did not destroy Spain, but his body, his blood, his inherited fate revealed just how hollow the foundation had become. The ashes under his tongue may have been myth, but the bitterness was real. The bitterness of decay, of knowing that by the time the war ended, Spain would be something else entirely. Still a kingdom, perhaps, but no longer feared, no longer envied, no longer whole. Just a name, passed from hand to hand like a coin too worn to spend. When the surgeons gathered to perform the autopsy, they expected something unpleasant. But what they found inside Charles II was not merely unpleasant, it was monstrous. One of the physicians reportedly left the room without a word. Another refused to speak of the body ever again. The few who remained documented what they saw, but even their words seemed to recoil from the truth. The body was barely holding itself together. His heart was described as the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were decayed. His intestines were ulcerated. His stomach was bloated with undigested food, despite having barely eaten. And his brain was filled with fluid, swollen and pale, as if thought had never properly taken root. Every organ seemed misplaced or malformed. It was not a corpse, it was a confession in flesh. They had always whispered that Charles was sickly, cursed, touched by something unnatural. But it wasn't until the blade parted his skin that those whispers screamed. His testicles were blackened. His body emitted a stench that no amount of perfumes could mask. His bones, when sawn, crumbled slightly, like damp chalk. His mouth still gaped open, as it had in life, the enormous tongue pressing against the cracked teeth. His face, once hidden beneath powdered wigs and painterly flourishes, now sagged in on itself. Sunken eyes, stretched lips, twisted jaw. One physician tried to measure the jaw, but gave up when it resisted closure, even in death. This was not a king. This was a warning from nature. The official report tried to maintain dignity. It used words like inflammation and imbalance, phrases meant to sound scientific, but their vagueness betrayed discomfort. They did not know how to explain what they had found. Some wrote that his body had rotted from within. Others speculated that it was divine punishment, or perhaps divine abandonment. A priest present for the autopsy reportedly muttered prayers not for the soul, but for protection, as if afraid the very act of looking inside Charles might taint those present. There was no moment of peace, no final dignity, just horror, unspoken but heavy in the room like a fog. The silence afterward lasted longer than the autopsy itself. In the months that followed, rumors spread through Europe like a sickness of their own, that Charles had no blood in his veins, that his body had never aged past childhood, that his liver was missing, that his body had been filled with worms. Most of it was false. But none of it felt impossible. He had lived like a myth, impossible to understand, suspended between awe and disgust. And in death, he became what many had always suspected. Not a man, but a symbol of a bloodline pushed past reason, past compassion, past the point of return. The autopsy did not bring answers. It brought closure of a darker kind. Confirmation that the Spanish crown, so proud, so sacred, had been carried not by strength or wisdom, but by a body stitched together from generations of fear, repetition, and silence. What history remembers is rarely what was most real. The records give us names, dates, titles. They give us the word king, followed by Charles II of Spain. They give us genealogies, portraits, alliances, decrees. But they do not give us the room he died in. They do not give us the sheets that had to be changed 3 times a night. They do not give us the stink of an unwashed body, of rotting teeth, of a mouth that could not close. They do not give us the air in the chamber, thick with candle wax and unspoken fear. What history forgets, mercifully, is the smell. And in this case, that is perhaps a kindness. Imagine reading the same sentence twice, and the second time it reeks. That's what it would be if scent lived in the archive. Charles's story, already grotesque, already heavy with deformity and sorrow, would collapse under the weight of its own stench. Because this is a story of rot, not only in the body, but in the idea of inheritance. Power passed like a disease, bones softened by repetition. Every generation more desperate than the last to preserve something that was already lost. But the nose remembers what the pen refuses. Visitors to the court described the air as oppressive. His servants wore gloves. His doctors gagged behind fans. This was not a rule. It was a fermentation. A slow cooking of human misfortune behind gold-framed doors. And yet, in paintings, he looks almost noble. That's the trick, isn't it? Oil hides what flesh cannot. The canvas doesn't wrinkle or weep or seep fluid through royal linens. It shows a stiff upper lip painted firmly over a lower one that hung like meat. No smell clings to a portrait. No artist ever dipped their brush in bile. We see Charles today and think, unfortunate or strange, but not nauseating. We don't recoil. We don't breathe through our mouths, because we weren't there. And because history, good, orderly, clean history, lets us look at horror without ever smelling it, as if that makes it less real. But for those who were there, the smell was part of the story. The decay of a man who was never whole. The scent of an empire whose breath grew shorter each day. They burned incense not for prayer, but for survival. They opened windows even in winter. They whispered of demonic possession not because of theology, but because something had to explain the air, the sores, the gasps. Today we call it genetics. Back then, they just called it wrong. So when we read of Charles II now, we are spared the part that made it unbearable. We are spared the thing that clung to walls and robes and skin. The one thing the archives could not preserve. The one thing that made even the loyalists look away. And maybe in that we are lucky. Maybe forgetting the smell is the only grace this story has left. You've heard the story, not of triumph, but of slow unraveling. A name carved in stone, but a body too fragile to hold it. Let it rest now. Let the weight of it drift away. There'll be another tale when the night returns. But for now, just sleep.